While the body count in Gaza topped 8,000 on Thursday as a result of continued strikes by Israel's Air Force against the civilian population, the United Nations General Assembly continued its debate on what to do about it. This was the permanent representative of the Russian Federation, Vasily Nebenzya, outlining the violations of UN Security Council resolutions and fundamental international law that he claimed Israel is making.
President, distinguished colleagues, on the one part, the entire international community has recognized that Israel's activities in the occupied Palestinian territory are illegal because they're at odds with UN Security Council resolutions and the provisions of international law. That's on the one hand, and on the other hand, our Western colleagues in their statements prefer to simply forget that this unprecedented escalation on the ground is also a consequence of the settlement policy of West Jerusalem, as well as the systematic restrictions West Jerusalem has placed on the Palestinians' ability to freely visit their holy sites. We're delighted that Antonio Guterres did not shy away from flagging this, speaking during Security Council deliberations on the Middle East on the 24th of October. He noted that the current uptick in violence did not happen in a vacuum. As a result, he was immediately subjected to irate and undeserved criticism on the part of Israel, which preferred to see history starting from a black page, to see history begin on the 7th of October 2023. Colleagues, we'll all have to return to the root causes of the conflict. We'll have to put the Israeli-Palestinian settlement process on an agreed track. However, right now, we need to immediately cease fire and put an end to the bloodshed. This should be obvious to all, you'd think. Unfortunately, our Western colleagues at the Security Council are continuing to torpedo any efforts to de-escalate the situation on the ground. They continue to block the UN Security Council's attempt to urgently take measures to immediately normalize the situation, first and foremost to enact a ceasefire. This is what common sense dictates. What's more it's what humanitarian organizations in Gaza are calling for. Clearly, the fully fledged ground operation Israel has begun in Gaza can turn not just into a tragedy for 2 million Gazans, it can also trigger a regional conflagration. You'd think that everyone understands just how dangerous this scenario is, and yet it's only Washington which won't listen, which hypocritically is trying to pursue its own regional agenda, politicizing UN Security Council draft resolutions, trying to pass them, but we did not allow it to pass, nor did China. Our US colleagues are trying not just to divert attention from the failures of their policy to shift blame when it is itself at fault. They are accusing Iran, Hezbollah, and Gazans of all of the world's ills. They're also trying to legitimize all this, legitimize the ground operation through the Security Council. We remember the no-fly zone in Libya in 2019 when our Western colleagues had no trouble interpreting UN Security Council Resolution 1973 to their own benefit, waging an aggression on Libya. The UN Security Council does not have the right to grant this kind of carte blanche. President, I'd like to highlight that when we condemn the killing of Israeli civilians and foreigners in Israel, when we do that, we still cannot turn a blind eye to what Western Jerusalem is doing. They're committing flagrant violations of international humanitarian law in Gaza. Entire neighborhoods are being razed to the ground. According to information, we have over 8.5 thousand people have been killed in the enclave. Many of them, most of them, are women, children, and the elderly. Indiscriminate airstrikes have taken over 3,000 lives. Young Gazans are lying there under the rubble. Over 2,000 of them. Half of them are children. As a result of the latest strike on the Jabalia refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, over 400 people died. The number of losses amongst UN personnel is staggering. 64 people have been killed, 22 have been injured, and 42 UNRWA objects have been destroyed. The number of IDPs in the Gaza Strip stands at 1.6 million people. As a result of the bombing of the Strip, 9 hospitals are completely out of commission. The rest of the hospitals are facing acute shortages of medicines. Over 100 people, including over 300 people, including many of them children, have also perished in the West Bank. Against this backdrop, Israeli officials are making insulting pronouncements regarding all Palestinians, talking about the collective responsibility of an entire people, responsibility for the actions of Hamas. Israel's orders to evacuate over 1 million people are pronouncements that do not hold water. Also, the total blockade imposed by Israel on the Strip is unacceptable. It's cut off from the rest of the world. This blockade has provoked panic amongst these frightened people who've lost all hope. It's undermined the work of medical and emergency staff and will inevitably result in greater civilian casualties. You cannot vanquish terrorism using these means. We call on the parties to the conflict to immediately put an end to the bloodshed, to give mediators an opportunity to seek a diplomatic solution, including the swift release of hostages. We will have to go down this path sooner or later. The question is how many innocent people will die until the decision is taken to do so. President, colleagues, we cannot but mention the hypocrisy of the US and their allies. They, in other completely different situations, are issuing appeals for the respect of humanitarian law, establishing investigations, committees, imposing sanctions on those who are actually genuinely only resorting to force as a last resort to put an end to years of violence. And yet today we're witnessing horrific destruction in Gaza, greater than all the West criticizes in other regions, greater by many orders of magnitude. We're seeing strikes on humanitarian objects, including hospitals, thousands of children dying, horrific suffering on the part of civilians under conditions of a total blockade, and yet the West remains silent. The only thing they can muster is continued pronouncements about Israel's supposed right to self-defense, although as an occupying power, it does not have that power, as confirmed by the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice handed down in the year 2004. We hope that these blatant double standards are obvious to our colleagues in the Global South. As for Israel's security, and we recognize its right to ensure its security, this security can only be fully guaranteed if we resolve the Palestinian issue on the basis of relevant UN Security Council resolutions. We do not deny Israel the right to fight terrorism, but fight the terrorists. Don't fight civilians. Otherwise, you yourselves are taking the side of evil. You are deploying the same methods evil deploys. The Jewish people suffered persecution for many centuries, and the Jewish people should know better than anyone that the suffering of ordinary people, innocent lives lost, in the name of blind retribution, will neither restore justice nor bring the dead back to life nor console their families. Islam, Christianity, Judaism are united in recognizing the value of human life, which belongs to God. God giveth, and only God is entitled to take it away. In these very testing times, the Russian Federation is taking active measures to immediately resolve the crisis. We are very much in favor of an ongoing negotiation process at an endorsed UN forum, following which we should establish a sovereign Palestinian state within 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, living side by side in peace and security with Israel. On this note, we'd like to commend the efforts of the Arab group, spearheaded by Jordan. They authored the UNGA resolution adopted on the 27th of October. That resolution called for urgent measures to put an end to the violence, to the military hostilities, to immediately release hostages, to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and to disallow the conflict spilling over into the rest of the region. The Russian Federation wholeheartedly supported this Arab peace initiative. In fact, we are one of the co-sponsors. We urge all states to implement it. President, we stand convinced that in addition to resolving this new uptick in violence, we must put paid to this upsurge in violence, but also come up with a strategy of collective action to achieve the political resolution of this conflict. First and foremost, we need to put an end to the violence, unless we want to put away the idea of resolving this conflict one day. Thank you.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.